You're listening to the Otis Jiry channel.
Chapter 3 The Grimsfeld Witch. The professor had trouble sleeping that night, with so many questions on his mind which he wanted answering. After breakfast, he was taken aside by Abbot Gregory. "Professor, it's happened again. Brother Edward has gone missing. Do you think we should just wait to see if he returns, or should we go to look for him? We can gather up a little search party later on." "I guess it's best we look for him in case he's injured. Do you know if the brothers frequent the cliffs?" "Why do you ask?" "Because a chap in the village said he's sometimes seen monks from the abbey walking near the sea and the mausoleum," he added. "I'm sure that's possible. Overlooking the sea from up high is a good place to sit and think." "It's dangerous up there." "Quite so, Professor. I've also occasionally seen brothers venture beyond the vegetable garden and up to the cemetery, to look at the names on the stones, I would imagine. As I've said, our mausoleum has long been closed and derelict, and I'm sure no one goes there. I'm going to go down to the village again this morning, so shall we all meet up after lunch to have a look around? I'll keep my eyes open in the village." "Yes, I'll see if any of the brothers can spare an hour or two from their duties. I'm sure they're as concerned as we are." After leaving the abbey by the front gates, the professor walked around the back and looked up toward the mausoleum at the base of the mountain. He couldn't help thinking that the building was holding a sinister secret and must be investigated. Back at the Witch's Brew, he sat down at one of the trestle tables in the central area of the room. A few people were in the alcoves, but nowhere near as many as yesterday. The landlord bustled in the door laden with bread and vegetables in woven wicker baskets, and acknowledged the professor on his way to the kitchen. He soon joined him at the table. "Well, that's most of today's meals sorted out. Just need to collect the eggs and chickens from the farm. Do you still want to hear the story of Alice Bennet?" "Wait a minute. Alice Bennet, did you say? The witch?" "Because I met a Rose Bennet yesterday. Rose says she's a descendant of the centuries-old Bennet family who lived in the village when it was much smaller. The story goes that Alice had 3 brothers who became monks at the abbey while she stayed at home with her father. Her mother had died when her youngest brother was born. Alice took long walks up to the crag, Lover's Crag as it's now called, and was often seen staring out to sea. The Bennet women would never marry so as to keep their name." The next part of the story describes how she disappeared for many days at a time, but no one knew where she'd gone or saw her leave. It's all here in these old papers, which were found in the wall when we put in the extra window there, by the stairs," he pointed. He clutched the papers in one hand and his ale in the other, and continued. "The young folk used the crag for somewhere out of the way for their courting. They still do. But the young women began to change personality and seemed to age prematurely, eventually becoming withered, stooping crones. The young men turned away from them, and soon afterwards these women vanished." The landlord was leaning forward, rather enjoying telling the story that gave his pub its name, and the professor wondered if he was just making it all up. He continued his story. "The parents and friends searched everywhere for their daughters, but could find no clue as to the reason for their disappearance. That's when the folks started putting 2 and 2 together. Alice Bennet was missing at the same times as the women," he added excitedly, gathering up saliva. "Then in the 30s the cave was discovered by a group of young fossil hunters." "A cave?" "Beneath the crag they found a cave, but not just any old crack in the cliff, mind you. No, it ties up with what's described in the old papers. This cave was home to a witch's coven. Alice Bennet was one of the witches who was able to use magic spells to influence the young girls meeting their lovers on the crag immediately above the cave entrance. They regularly chanted and gesticulated to gradually sap the passion and lust from them until they eventually became ugly crones. It was the magical energy by which they were able to procure more of their kind, by eventually luring them into their secret coven within the cave. Centuries ago, so the story goes, the villagers got into the cave and set about attacking and murdering the witches, all except Alice, who miraculously changed into an immortal crow and flew out of the cave to safety. The landlord looked up at the professor to see his reaction to the climax of his tale. "Damn, you couldn't make it up, could you?" "Well, that's exactly what I need to ask you. Did you make it up to create interest in visiting the pub together with the witches' theme?" The landlord looked shocked and crestfallen at the professor's suggestion, and stared back at him with convincing eyes. "I tell you, it's all here," he said, shaking the tattered papers and offering them to be looked at. The professor took them from him and made a space on the large table to lay them out one by one. "They certainly look old, but not that old. Perhaps someone thought it up and hid the papers in the wall as a joke a long time ago, just for someone like yourself to believe it. But that part of the wall we removed was the original from when it was built. I'm sure of that. It used to be a large farmhouse with an adjoining barn, built centuries ago." "Who exactly is telling these stories?" queried the professor. "They're stories handed down from generation to generation, and these papers seem to confirm it. I do know that stories change a bit every time they're retold, perhaps with fanciful additions to make it more interesting and exciting, something that people like to believe, like flying saucers. A couple of years after the war ended, a disc was described as having crashed on a farm in the U.S., and from then on it was visitors from space. Everyone and his dog were seeing them. But the disappearances, they're still going on from the Abbey and children from the village. It could all be linked, Professor." "I doubt it. It's still in the realms of supernatural fiction, with the abbot telling me that the monks seem to be possessed by demons up until they vanish. It's very similar, I'll grant you that. Does Rose know about this?" "I think she does, but doesn't like to dwell on thoughts that her great-great-great relative, however many greats it is, was a witch, however unbelievable and bizarre." An hour had passed, and the professor thanked the landlord for the story and asked if he could keep the papers safe for him to examine at a later time. On arriving back at the Abbey, the search party was organized and gathering at the front of the building, headed by the abbot, resplendent in a green waxed jacket and matching green Wellington boots and gloves. "I'm sorry I'm a bit late," called out the professor. "Heard a good story at the pub." It was decided to check around the cliffs, arming various monks with binoculars to scan the little coves. The abbot had mustered about a dozen brothers who trekked in a long line down to the cliffs and up the little hill to the perilous rocky cliff edge. 2 hours later they were none the wiser. No evidence of Brother Edward was found. Professor Benson made the bold suggestion that it would be a good idea to look inside the mausoleum. "No, it's been shut up for centuries, as far as I know," piped up a brother at the back of the group. "It would be too risky for us to go in there." The professor's suspicions were immediately raised. Did this fellow know something he didn't want the rest of them to find out about? The abbot shook his head and decided it was too near dusk for anyone to venture into the dangerous old building. "Some of us will have a look there tomorrow," he suggested. "Now, for some supper." That evening, the professor retold the witch story to Abbot Gregory, who seemed to listen intently. "Well, what do you think? See any links?" "A crow, you say? Immortal?" "This Alice Bennet became a crow and flew away to safety in the story," commented the abbot. "Yes, a crow. The other day you said you saw ravens and a crow flying up to the abbey roof?" Coincidence, just coincidence. Are you saying we are dealing with the supernatural here? It's just a possibility, for I too have a story to tell that's been passed on here at the Abbey for centuries, not just by word of mouth either. It's been written as fact and updated centuries ago in a book in the library. In light of what you've told me, it might be relevant, otherwise I wouldn't have mentioned it. Can I see the book? Asked the professor eagerly. Yes, we can go along and you can read it for yourself, if you would rather that than me tell you from memory. I would like to see it anyway, if you have the time. The vast library was in the ancient Gothic part of the Abbey, which, along with the crypt, had miraculously survived a terrible fire centuries before. Tall, narrow windows illuminated by day and electric light when needed. The abbot flicked a long row of brown bakelite switches, and lamps lit up along the tops of the shelves. At the far end of the library stood a large, sturdy wooden cabinet, which protected some of the more valuable and rare volumes. He produced an old set of keys on a rusting ring, and selected the appropriate key and slipped it into the lock. The brass-framed glass door was held open by an ornate levered arrangement, also of brass. "Here it is!" exclaimed the abbot, as he reached in to retrieve the gilt-edged book. "Smaller than I remember." Some pages fell open easily, whilst others stubbornly stuck together, but with careful manipulation the abbot allowed them to reveal their contents. The first mention is here in the 16th century, 1539, if I can read it. My translation's a bit rusty these days, not much call for it. It says that some monks had left their duties and could not be found. Also that they were blasphemous and displayed rudeness to their fellow brothers with no explanation. A later entry tells of the discovery of a secret chamber next to the abbey crypt, where the monks were seen and heard to blaspheme openly with gesticulation, not of their training, conjuring demonic forms to their satisfaction, resulting in ecstatic posturing. Another entry here, much later, in 1564, it refers to the same practice which had been ended by Forrest. It tells of the underground river which served our wells and whose provenance is from beneath Oros, that's our mountain. The force needed to overcome the demonic brothers led to them throwing themselves into the river and were swept violently away, it says. But with the exception of 3 monks, who were sibling brothers, who held themselves together with the force of many demons, and escaped through the air above the river as ravens. Professor, dare I say it? You saw 3 ravens and a crow. But here's the link. The 3 brothers' surname was Bennett. My goodness, this is interesting. So we have 4 siblings, the Bennetts, who were supposedly born in the village. 3 males who became demonic monks here in this abbey in the 16th century, and their sister who becomes a witch during the same period, all with the power to transform themselves into corvids. 3 male ravens and a female crow to live forever. It's difficult to believe, Professor, but it looks as if they are still active here, immortal no less. By now the abbot was sitting down, trying to take in fiction which appeared to be fact. Coven. Underneath the rocky crags lived a coven of old hags. Beware their evil magic spell, it will send you straight to hell. Tongue of bat and foot of crow, what they'll do is hard to know. As the cauldron starts to boil, someone's life is set to spoil. Lovers walk the crags above, sending out the power of love. This the witches drain away, for their spells the lovers pay. At the end of the day, the sunlight fades, no longer falling on the glades. Now is heard the dreadful drone of each and every wretched crone.